Harley-Davidson hits the racetrack in the final part of our trilogy, all about the Road Glide CVO. It's all about this beast's performance on the circuit. What we experienced out there and all the details about it, you'll see that now. So, quite a few things have already made their way over to us here in Europe from America, not just events and occasions like Halloween and so on, but also the bugger racing series featuring Harley-Davidson. It's not just Harley-Davidson going head-to-head over there on the track. Other brands like Indian are also in the mix. But for this final part of our Road Glide CVO trilogy, we wanted to take a look at how our light tune-up performs on the track. Most importantly, just how much king of the baggers is actually in this bike and how much of that is already packed into a stock Harley. We've made a few light modifications, mainly focusing on the suspension. You'll find all the details in our previous parts. We also put it on the dyno to see how the engine performs. Just as a quick reminder, the engine here is running 121 cubic inches. That gave us a peak output of 108 horsepower at the rear wheel and 167 Newton meters of torque. That should really be enough. But is it actually enough? Well, we're about to find out on the Panoniaring. I didn't just ride the circuit, I actually rode the whole way there to see how the whole setup performs out on the road too. Is it still usable for everyday riding, or is it now a pure racetrack machine? You'll see the answer in just a moment. Just a moment ago we were still in the race lab, and now we're already at the beautiful Panoniaring with glorious weather. We've brought our heavyweight cruiser, the Harley-Davidson Road Glide CVO, and put it on full display. This track is the perfect ground to push it to the limit and see how it handles under ideal conditions. I've played around a bit with the electronics and made a few adjustments, and now we're gonna see how it all comes together on the circuit. Let's go. So those are the first impressions of our flagship from the Harley-Davidson stable. Out on the racetrack it behaves pretty much exactly as you'd expect from a machine like this. You're talking over 400 kilos of total weight, and yet thanks to the suspension setup it's actually surprisingly manageable. Handling is really decent. Harley-Davidson bikes with their V-twins have a very low center of gravity and quite a narrow crankshaft. That means you don't feel the weight quite as directly when it comes to handling. Of course, you do notice it when accelerating and braking. Those kilos definitely make themselves known. But overall, I've got to say, I've never ridden around a racetrack in such comfort, and with music playing too. We've got this massively wide fairing, and honestly, there's no wind pressure at all, even at 180 kilometers an hour. And what's really pleasing, especially compared to some of the previous models, is the excellent stability. Even at top speed, there was no wobble whatsoever. You could really stay on the throttle with full confidence. It's limited, as mentioned, to around 180 kilometers per hour, but up to that point, the bike was genuinely calm and surprisingly precise. You could take fast corners quickly and confidently. The limiting factor, though, is definitely the lean angle. We already tried to raise the bike a bit with the suspension. We are sitting about 1.5 centimeters higher than stock, But with these wide protruding floorboards acting as footrests, they scrape incredibly early. You'd really need to make some changes to the riding position and ergonomics to get it truly performing on the track. But that would mean going a bit deeper into things, and that would have gone beyond the scope of what we wanted to do here. Maybe we'll push a bit further in that direction later on, but for now the idea was really just to see how it handles with a few light modifications that can easily be applied to a standard bike. So those were the first quick impressions here at the Panoniaring. Back home in the race lab, we'll take a much closer look. I'll go into all the details there, and that's where you will find out more. Welcome back to the race lab. Now let's dive a bit deeper for those of you who want more technical detail. As I mentioned earlier, we're dealing with a bike that weighs just under 400 kilos overall, and you do notice that. Interestingly, you feel it most when the bike is stationary in the paddock, when you're maneuvering it. You really have to be careful to keep it properly balanced, because even turning the bars can shift the center of gravity and the contact patch. So the bike starts to tip quite easily, and you really can't allow too much lean at that point. Otherwise, it becomes almost impossible to hold it upright because it just gets too heavy. That's definitely the part where you need to pay the most attention. But as soon as you get a few km /h on the speedo, it's all fine. You hardly notice those 400 kilos anymore. The agility is surprisingly good. Thanks to the narrow design, due to the V-twin engine, which despite its massive displacement is quite slim because the cylinders are arranged lengthwise, the bike actually feels quite nimble. And you've also got a very low center of gravity given how low slung the whole bike is. One thing that really stands out here is the Öhlins suspension. The stock components are obviously tuned first and foremost for comfort, though even that is fairly limited. The Harley does have one small drawback, and that's its relatively short suspension travel. At the rear shock, we've only got around 80 to 90 millimeters of travel. And if you compare that to a typical road bike, which usually has well over 120 to 140 millimeters, it's obviously quite limited. Suspension can only absorb as much as the available travel allows. And that's where Harley-Davidson bikes, from a suspension perspective, start to struggle a bit, because you need to run stiffer springs to avoid using up all the travel too quickly and bottoming out. Especially when there's a passenger on the back, the system still needs to handle that extra load. And that's why even with the stock components, which are tuned more toward comfort, the bike still ends up feeling quite firm and sporty. So you really can't expect high levels of comfort here. With the Öhlins shocks, it doesn't get dramatically stiffer. Instead, the responsiveness improves. You're not getting any more travel, even with the upgraded fork. Up front, we've got 117 millimeters of travel. At the rear, you're still limited to around 90 millimeters at the axle in total compression. And if you subtract 1 to 2 centimeters for static sag, there's not a whole lot left to work with. But that's not a flaw in the Öhlins components. It's simply because the bike's basic design doesn't allow for more travel. If you went beyond that, the rear tire would start hitting the bump stop or even the underside of the fender. So we're really up against hard limitations in the overall chassis design, which is why we can't push it further. On the racetrack, though, you don't necessarily need all that much travel. What matters more there is predictability and good feedback from the tires. And in that regard, this suspension setup really shines. We've fitted a relatively firm base damping and the spring setup too. For example, in the fork, we're running a 12.0 spring, whereas the stock bike comes with an 11.0. So that's been stiffened up a bit. The reason behind that is simple. When you're braking hard on the racetrack, you really don't want those 400 kilos pushing the fork all the way to the bump stop. The only way around that is to go for stronger springs. And it worked very well. On the racetrack, I was able to brake hard right to the limit. The ABS allowed a lot of room to play with. And it's worth noting we were still on the stock tires, no slicks or anything like that. I'll mention a few things about that later. But the bottom line is, it worked really well. Strong braking, strong acceleration, and no major instability. What was also really noticeable was how the overall setup of the bike, which, as we know from its predecessors, used to be quite unstable, has really improved. On earlier models, once you hit around 120 or 130 kilometers per hour, you'd often get a bit of wobble or vague feedback along the longitudinal axis, and that stability was something you missed. Now though, I have to say, even at high speeds, I rode it up to 180 kilometers per hour, the Harley is totally stable. You get really good feedback. The bike stays composed even under heavy acceleration, which makes it much easier to push it to its limits in a more spirited riding style. Even when you're riding right at the limit, it handles really well. Thanks to the long wheelbase, you can push the rear end or the rear tire close to the edge without it suddenly breaking loose or reacting aggressively. You get a good sense of where the grip ends and how far you can go. The engine mapping also worked well in this regard. It made it surprisingly easy to ride this bike right up to its limits. But of course, the limiting factors here are all the stock parts, primarily the foot controls, which are wide floorboards, then the crash bars, the side stand, and finally the exhaust, which sticks out quite far to the side. All of that ends up restricting lean angle and cornering performance. The tires and the suspension could handle a lot more. Naturally, you can try, and I did, to shift your body weight more to the inside of the corner to keep the bike more upright through the bends. That works to a certain extent, but because of the cruiser-style riding position, which we didn't modify, it's actually quite hard to shift your weight that way. The footboards are positioned in a way that makes it difficult to brace yourself and lean properly into the inside of the curve. So if you're aiming for track performance, that's clearly an area that still needs some changes. And since we were already so limited in terms of lean angle, we didn't bother switching to super high grip tires like slicks. That would have required changing the wheel sizes, because the stock bike comes with larger wheels and there are hardly any slick options for those dimensions. So we would have had to switch to 17-inch rims, which would have been a pretty big job, especially for what was intended as a quick tune-up. Anyone who knows the road to the Panoniaring knows it's far from smooth. In fact, it's really uneven, with loads of bumps and harsh hits along the way. And that's exactly where you start to notice the firm base setup. I dialed the damping quite far back for the ride down, but because of the stiffer springs we installed, you definitely still feel it quite a lot. Of course, you could retune this suspension more towards comfort by choosing softer spring rates and focusing more on road comfort. That would really help improve everyday rideability. But we were after maximum track performance, so we left the setup in its sportiest base configuration and rode it just like that. We already talked quite a bit about the engine in part 2. We saw how the power delivery behaves. It's a strong performer, even in stock form, one of the most powerful production engines Harley-Davidson offers. And it delivers solid performance. That's obviously a big help on the racetrack too. But there's one caveat. The usable ref range on an engine like this is still quite limited. You get a maximum of around 5,500 to just under 6,000 RPM. But you still need at least 2,000 to 3,000 RPM to get any meaningful drive out of it. It definitely pulls well from very low down. But for the racetrack, that's just not quite enough. You really need to be in a certain minimum ref range. That leaves you with only about 3,000 RPM of usable power band, which means you end up doing quite a bit of shifting. You can't just roll along from low revs like you would on the road. Sure, that's possible, but on the racetrack you want proper drive. And for that you'll be working the gearbox quite a lot. A quick shifter would definitely help here, making those frequent gear changes much faster and smoother. Another important point, which some of you might be curious about, is the electronics. There aren't a huge number of settings to tweak, but you do get some preset modes along with 2 fully customizable ones. That means you can mix and match the features you want as a rider and build your own setup. There are two freely programmable modes, and in them you can define things like how much maximum power the engine delivers, throttle response, traction control settings, and so on. One thing I can already say is that in the sport mode, where throttle response is more aggressive, it's actually almost too aggressive. It becomes a bit tricky to apply the throttle smoothly, especially when leaned over in a corner, and that's exactly when you need really precise and gentle input. That initial throttle application is a bit too abrupt in that mode. The traction control, on the other hand, worked really well. I pushed it into the limit zone a few times, got it to intervene, and it handled power reduction very nicely. It gives you a good safety net, but still allows a healthy amount of acceleration. That part was definitely convincing and gives a solid foundation to build on. One thing that was definitely annoying and probably no surprise is the speed limiter. Even on the Panoniaring, where you don't have super long straights, the speed limiter still kicks in at 180 km/h. The engine could easily push beyond that even on the short straights. It would be nice if that limiter could be removed. What deserves a really positive mention is the braking system. Earlier models weren't exactly known for being super sharp in this area, but I have to say the Road Glide we had performed really well. Braking was strong, and even in the hot conditions we had today, around 30 degrees, it didn't fade even under racetrack stress. That goes for both the front and rear brakes. Even the ABS did a decent job. Despite running stock tires, which started to smear a bit in the heat, the ABS still allowed for strong deceleration and kept the bike nice and stable under braking. That was definitely one of the standout positives. So back to our opening question, how much king of the baggers is actually in the stock Road Glide CVO, just as we had it? Well, to be fair, the bike's basic DNA isn't exactly built for the racetrack. It's designed for touring and relaxed cruising. If you really want to take it onto the track, you've got to dig deep. With our light modifications, we've started paving the way, but to actually cross the finish line first, there's a lot more needed. First of all, we need significantly more cornering clearance. That means all the bolt-on parts would have to be raised considerably, shortened at the sides, and different footpegs installed. The riding position still has too much of a touring feel. What we need is something more forward-oriented, and we'd achieve that by raising the seat quite a bit, because in stock form it's really low. That would allow us to move the footpegs further back, lower, and shift the clip-ons or handlebars more forward, giving us a much sportier base setup in terms of riding position. That in turn makes it way easier for the rider to handle the bike and develop proper feel for it. You'd also automatically get more cornering clearance. Pair that with a freer flowing exhaust system, which would also give the engine a bit more punch across the whole rev range, and you'd get performance that's especially useful on the racetrack. You'd also need to convert to 17-inch wheels to be able to fit slicks. Those would give you the reserves and grip you need to fully exploit the big lean angles that this setup would now allow, and to accelerate hard even from deep lean. And of course, one of the key changes would be removing the speed limiter at 180 km/h, because on the track it's not exactly thrilling to get stuck on the straight at 180. So yeah, those are the main modifications still missing in our current setup if we really wanted to get this thing performing properly on track. Of course, that still wouldn't put it on the same level as the top spec king of the baggers race bikes from the States. Those have almost nothing in common with the original production bikes anymore. You'd have to go really deep with the changes, and that's well beyond what we intended to explore here. Our idea was simply to show what's possible with some mild modifications, and to answer the question, what's it like to ride a Harley like this on track? Hopefully, it was an interesting little detour for you too. Definitely something different. Probably not quite what the original designers had in mind for this bike, but it's always exciting to try something completely unconventional. Great to have you with us till the end. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see, maybe we'll even do another video or two with some additional tune-ups on our Harley Davidson. It'll be staying in our fleet for a little while longer, so we'll keep you posted. All the best, and see you next time.